We're actually actively going into government buildings, talking to these elected officials and really demanding of what we want and getting it done, actually. Again, young people have led the civil rights movement. They've led all of these movements from the very start, and it's no different to the climate movement. We are all leaders in our own perspective, rights, and in our own communities, and all we have to do is continue using our voices to make that difference.
Hello everybody. Welcome to episode 7, season 2 of Our New World. We continue talking to future leaders, and the future leader we've got on today is Kevin Patel. He's a remarkable guest in a lot of ways. I was really excited to talk to him. He started climate activism from a very young age, partly after being affected by the air quality situation in his city, but also because his family has a background in agriculture, and he learned a lot about that when he was younger, so he started teaching that to his peers in school. A theme that comes up a lot in this conversation is how to use your voices. And Kevin, he started an organisation that enables young people to involve themselves more in activism, but also be very objective focused and clear in how to do that. And I think that's something that we all struggle with trying to get involved in the climate crisis, is how to use our voices and what actions to take, which is the whole point of this podcast. And Kevin does a really fantastic job of giving ideas, giving actions, giving tidbits of advice on how to get involved in local areas in our communities, but also in the wider picture. So once again, Kevin is a fantastic guest, really interesting conversation. Really enjoyed speaking to him, and I hope you get a lot out of it, because I certainly did. Kevin, thank you very much for joining us on Our New World.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So part of this podcast is to inspire action in people, help educate people, give people some knowledge to feed off. What was it that sparked your own action? What was it that made you decide that you wanted to get involved in climate change?
Of course, I think I have to go back very far back into when I was quite young. I started at a very young age, actually. So both my parents are immigrants. They came to this country to look for better opportunities, but their parents are inherently farmers. My parents are from India, both of them. And given their farming background, they brought a lot of that knowledge here to America. And, while I was growing up, I was learning a lot of that knowledge that my parents had learned, that we can grow our own food, that, wherever we are at, my dad was always the person that kind of taught me all these skills, and this just educated me about, food and farming practices and whatnot. And so I kind of learned about food justice at a very young age, and that we can grow our own food. And I think that's the first issue that I got involved with, was food injustice and food security. And that was around my fifth grade to sixth grade year, where I was really here in Los Angeles. It was quite stark in the sense of seeing food injustice and food inequalities of if you were to go to Calabasas or Beverly Hills, where a little bit more affluent area, you would see that there are more access, or there's just even an abundance of resources in the sense of non-GMO, organic, vegan food options. But when you were to come back to my community of Sausage, Los Angeles, or neighboring communities, you would see that there's actually not abundance of food, but there, food options, but abundance of fast food restaurants. Not even a block away from where I live, there would be a fast food restaurant.
Mm.
And so I think that's what, kind of was scary, is that a lot of my peers, a lot of the students, in my community, were not getting healthier options of food.
Yeah.
And so I really wanted to do something about that. And that's where I was advocating for, is that we can, like, from the practices that my dad taught me and my mom taught me, I really took those practices to school, and I really kind of utilized those in the sense of taking on the school garden. So my first action was really teaching my peers about food injustices and food inequalities, and making sure that they understood that they can grow their own food, that they can get healthier options, meals, that food doesn't just come from the fast food restaurants or the grocery store, but we can grow our own food that is healthy, and we can also create our own food. You would be surprised how many responses I would get of people not knowing, or my fellow peers not knowing, where food actually came from, which was so, stark and startling to me to realize that. And so I think that's where I first began. But I think second semester, I was directly impacted by the air and smog pollution, which kind of really caused me to understand that this is not just a one issue thing that my community is facing. It's a multitude of issues, right? From the fossil fuel industry right in our backyards, to the air and smog pollution, to the proximity to highways and freeways, and the lack of the tree coverage in our community, to just so many different issues that my community was facing. And so I understood, if I don't speak out against these injustices, then who will, right? If I
Yeah.
weren't to speak out against these injustices, then when will someone speak out against these injustices? Because these issues had been happening in my community for such a long time. And so I really wanted to do something about it. And ever since then, I've been speaking out, and not only speaking out, but also educating my community on the ways in which we can take action. And it kind of has transformed into something more international, national, even um, in local politics. Even in my local politics, it has transformed into something much larger. So I think that's like my journey towards activism, of how I saw one injustice and it turned into two. And um, I just understood it was not just one, but it was multitude, and there was many. And we have to utilize, the most powerful tool in our arsenal is our voices. And if we're not using our voices against these issues, they would never get solved. So
Yeah.
yeah.
I think that's a really good point. It's really interesting. Obviously, all of these things are linked in some ways, and it does, climate change is sort of inherently beneath all of them. Really interesting how you got from, one, and then you started continuing that trend of, you know, acting on what you see in front of you. I'm interested in how you went, what in getting involved in gardening in school and farming rather in schools. But I'm always interested in how people talk to their local communities. What are the first steps that people make? I'd say one of the tools that I hear most about is social media, which makes sense. How is it that you kind of reached out and breached that gap between being someone in your community to actually talking to your community? You said using your voice. How is it that you started using your voice? I'm just thinking about younger people today, how you would talk to them and inspire them to use your voice. What were the first steps that you took to do that?
Yeah, I guess at a very young age, at like 11 or 12, I think social media wasn't as prominent as it is today. And I think that really kind of led me to always staying doing my activism local to where I was. And so that was really just at school activism, of like, how can I go out into my community and really be someone that utilizes not only my voice, but be able to take actions via what I'm talking about, right?
Hmm.
And so I think that's, I started just utilizing my voice and speaking out against what was happening, and then coming up with ways of which to kind of take actions with my, from what I've said, and coming up with ways to solve these issues. And so I think the way that I communicated with others was just it was not through social media as much, but it was through school clubs. I always tried to get involved heavily quite a lot. And I think that also the modes of communication opened up through when I was in high school. I think a very early age. Not I wasn't only doing my activism in school anymore. I kind of utilized social media to do activism outside of school. So I was
Yeah.
working with the mayor's office and doing issues around unhoused community members, right?
Yeah.
And doing a lot of those type of issues to solve, just to solve a really broad scope of issues, but also kind of utilizing our voices to like get more young people involved who might not be aware of these issues. And I think it is quite important to see how people in today's sense communicate. But I think my very early age was like for 3 years I had not been like a lot of my mode of communication was only through my middle school
Mm.
and so my school community, and that's the way that I communicated and really kind of got others involved, and then it transformed into like me starting a school club so that a lot of people were informed about the issue and were able to really take a stance as well as take action against the issues that were quite important to me and to the community, and then also kind of integrating that with the community and talking to fellow community members, and then also working with the mayor's office, one on one about these issues was quite important to see. And then now it's really transformed because of the pandemic. Everyone has had to use social media in some shape or form for
Yeah.
like campaigns, for all these other modes of action and ways to utilize our voices to really get out the importance around these issues as well as action items for people to do. And so it's been really interesting to see the transitions a few years can do. Starting from at age 11 and 12, there wasn't that much of a social media boost of climate change or anything like that, at least
Yeah.
in my viewpoint. But I think now it's just so prominent. And so I think now a lot of people utilize social media as a tool to really educate others on these issues. But not only that, but also be able to mass mobilize people to take action on them.
Yeah, it definitely seems like one of the real positives of social media. As a teacher, I talk a lot about the negatives, but it is amazing the amount of people I talk to now who say, "Well, I've been able to join this, or I've learned this from social media," and as long as it's a reputable source, it is great. And like you said, the mass mobilization, I think, is a real factor. You think about strikes and climate rallies. It's a big thing, isn't it, these days? What would you say, or how would you say your roles changed to now? Do you think from what you did, from where you started, would you say you're doing similar things, or has it evolved into something quite different? Are you working in the actual climate change sector at the moment?
Yeah, I guess it has changed quite a lot, honestly. I think now I'm really working towards I'm working in the climate sector in the sense in the nonprofit sector.
Yeah.
I run my own nonprofit called One Up Action, and a lot of what we're doing and what our mission is to work with young people, but to implement actual climate solutions. And we take the frameworks of Project Drawdown and Regeneration, all the SDGs, and really have created a youth framework of solutions that we would support that would get us to where we're needing to go at.
Yeah.
And we just empower research. We empower leaders and young leaders at that with the resources to implement those climate solutions. And so that's a lot of the work that I'm going into now with the nonprofit, and it's a new journey. It's something that's completely new that hasn't been done before. Of really kind of relying on young people who are not just, I always say this, there's this axiom that leaders, young people are the leaders of tomorrow, but I think young people are not just the leaders of tomorrow, they're the leaders of today and tomorrow. And
Mm,
when we look at, history, a lot of these movements have been led by young people and young activists. And I think that's one of the beauty, what what I found so beautiful about this movement is that young people not only amplify this crisis, in a way that, mass mobilize tens and thousands of people or even millions of people, but actually bring urgency to this crisis, um, and are the ones who are creating the solutions and pushing those solutions to the forefront of, not only the conversation, but also to our world leaders and government officials. And I think that's something that I really want to continue supporting in young people is that ability to take action, even while quite a lot of world leaders, corporations, have this viewpoint of young people, to stay in school or do certain things that, that will lead us to in the next 30 years or in the next 10 years to step into the roles that they're in. But I think that is quite wrong, given that we are already the world leaders, that we're already the scientists, that we're already the teachers, that we're already doing all of these other things that fit the categories to really solving this issue. So I'm a huge advocate for young people in
yeah.
that sense. So it's really transitioned from talking about the issues that I face to really wanting to implement the climate solutions, not only in my community, but worldwide, and help young people do that. And so there's a huge emphasis on young people.
I think that's amazing, giving the confidence to young people to be able to do that, because something I
Mm-hmm.
would like to ask you is how hard is it to integrate young people into what is stereotypically, like you said, been an adult's world? People think about young people as, our future, but actually, the young people's voice is so important right now. They have a lot of new perspectives, a lot of new skills. How hard is it to integrate them and their knowledge, or lack of? And that's not meant to sound patronizing, but there's a lot that young people have to learn, just like adults. But young people have this, innate quality of just learning and learning and learning. So how is it that you sort of get them involved in policy making or talks or things like this when they might feel themselves that they're lacking the knowledge, or they're lacking the skills, or they're lacking the confidence to go toe to toe with adults?
Yeah, I think it isn't that hard. And I'll say this, I think, again, young people have led the civil rights movement. They've led all of these movements from the very start, and it's no different to the climate movement. I think when we're talking about, implementing, implementing laws, or advocating for laws, or just I think you're correct in that statement of like young people are always constantly learning and we're also constantly unlearning. I think
Mm,
the modes of our communication have grown so much is that we're not only learning at school, we're also learning via social media, via all these platforms and whatnot. And I have seen quite a lot of difference in the sense of the integration part of our movement and the ways in which our tactics and our methods have quite expanded. We're not only doing rallies, marches, and strikes anymore to kind of advocate around these issues. We're actually actively going into government buildings, talking to these elected officials and really demanding of what we want and getting it done actually, and if something doesn't exist, we're also creating new methods that haven't yet been created. And I think that's the beauty of young people of like there is no integration needed given that it's just about that piece of if one person can do it, others can do it. It's that how can we pass this knowledge on to these next leaders? And what I mean by that is like there are so many young people that are, doing this work that it's all a community of learning and just utilizing the different tactics. For instance, I in 2019, created the idea of having a youth climate commission within LA County, which LA County is huge. It has over 88 cities. It's one of the most powerful local governments in the United States.
Right.
And I had created the idea of the Youth Climate Commission, and I, obviously wanted to get that passed through LA County's Board of Supervisors. So me and my friend kind of partnered up. Another fellow activist by the name of Delaney Michelson her and I partnered up, and we spoke to the board of directors. Specifically, we spoke to the chief sustainability officer at that time, and we got it passed. We made it happen, and it became the first ever in the world, first ever in the nation. It had never been done before. And so I
Amazing.
think that's the truth. That's the really kind of the truth of the youth climate movement, is that if something doesn't exist, young people will create it. And I think it's that mode of like, if we didn't know that I think if we didn't know, if we didn't have the power to do stuff, we wouldn't do it. But I think a lot of young people know that we have the power to do stuff that our previous generations hadn't done,
Yeah.
to really solve these issues. And I think when we talk about integration, we talk about how young people are so innovative to be included. We insert our voices in everything. And I think
Yeah.
that's how, that is the reason why I said that, integration of young people isn't quite hard. It's making sure it's done, and it's done the right way. And I think there are different ways that young people are doing that and making sure that it's done the right way. But I think we still kind of are lacking that decision-making power, in the sense of, world leaders and government officials are still not the age bracket that we want them in, right? And what I mean by that is that they're a lot more older. And I think that's where young people fall short, is that we still don't have as much power in the sense of being elected to these positions to implement global climate solutions, or even really change the trajectory of implementation on climate solutions. So I think that's something that we as a movement have been collectively looking at of like, how can we pressure these leaders to act now and act swiftly on these issues, while we're also doing the same on a really hyper localized level, to implement climate solutions and get all of these changes to be made.
Yeah.
um, but I
Yeah.
yeah,
And
yeah.
sorry, go on, Kevin.
No, I was just going to add on of like how, if something happens in one place, it also happens in other places. And I think I've also spoken to so many young people of like how to start their own like youth climate commissions, or just even a council or a commission or anything like that, of having young people included in governments. I think that shift has began of like just educating others on the ways in which to do the same thing. And I think that education bit is quite important. As you mentioned, is that we are constantly learning, and we're always going to be learning. I think there's not going to be a point where we're not learning. And I think everyone needs to understand that there are three things that come into this: is that young people are really resilient. We we don't take no for an answer. We always try to come up
Yep.
with ways to we always try to come up with ways to do what we want to do and what we love to do. And I think and that really goes hard in saying that if we see an injustice, we're going to go you know to the extremes to make sure that we solve that said injustice. And um, that means creating our own policies, creating our own movements to really center around this issue and make sure that we solve it. And then two is that I think a lot of young people have come to the realization that we are constantly always learning. There's always more to learn. And I think we are so open to it that we tend to forget about what we've learned in the past and really relearn a lot of the things that are happening now in this day and age. And that's, I think, in my opinion, is really beautiful, because we think we take history from the past, and we really kind of make sure that it's not done, for our futures and for the next 7 generations. And then third, I think one of the things is that we're always constantly talking about these issues. There's always these conversations that are continuously happening. And I think all of these three elements have really transformed into action around these issues. And it's really quite beautiful to see.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I'd love to consider myself still young, but I suppose I'm on the outside now. But it is pretty great watching inside or watching the inside happening and everyone sort of flourishing. I think, like you alluded to as well, when you talk about power and public power, a lot
Mm-hmm.
of it probably comes down to representation and how represented young people are. And you know, I'm not a political expert, but I suspect that I feel anyway that there's a lot of unhappiness. People don't feel represented by governments
Mm-hmm.
currently, at least in England. That feels like the case amongst my peers. I imagine it's similar in America.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you agree with this, but that seems like a very big issue. But it sounds like things like One Up Action are trying to tackle is how young people are represented. Because one of the
Mm-hmm.
arguments against young people by older people is, well, they don't have the knowledge or skills or experience. That's one of the classic arguments to not sort of listen to people like Greta and things that I hear a lot. But I think rather than doing that, it's more about representation, having discussion and understanding how young people work. How do you think that One Up Action, I mean, if you do agree with that, but how do you think One Up Action and things like that are trying to get representation? You mentioned starting up groups and local governments. Do you think that's a priority?
I think that's definitely a priority. When we're talking about how can we get more accurate representation to what this day and age needs, I always look to the youth climate movement of like who is working on these policies, and I think it's every young person that's working on developing and advocating and pushing along policies that these leaders have yet to even grasp or even want to implement, right? And so I think that's something that I've seen, and something that I'm really, always advocating for. Like, how can we actually have young people at the table? What I mean by that, the decision making tables
Sure.
that these world leaders and these government officials usually, reserve for adults. And I think that's where, in 2019, I saw that. I think a lot of the conversations that I was having in that year. I think that year was really quite important to me, because that was not only when I started One Up Action, it was also when, like, the youth climate movement was really kind of getting started and amped up here in the United States, at least.
Yeah.
Given it only takes one spark to start a wildfire, and I think that wildfire was just starting in the United States, for at least the young people here during that time. But we've had leaders before us, Robert Bulliard, and so many other amazing people, Vandana Shiva, Ron Finley, all these amazing people who had been working on climate or issues that are really integrated or intersectional with climate. So definitely want to give them a shout out. But we've took a lot of what they have been, advocating for, and the knowledge that they have been spreading, and took it to our movement spaces and really integrated those knowledge and just everything that they have been pushing and into our movement spaces. And even in 2019, again, going back to the conversations that I have had with young people, a lot of what has happened is that a lot of young people have been feeling that sense of like, oh, we're not being truly represented in our communities. And those are the exact conversations that I had
Mm.
with young people at a climate strike, the very first climate strike, to keep in mind, and in March of 2019 in LA City, where I had to see how young people from like a completely different city that was 3 hours, 4 hours away were coming down to LA to have their voices heard. And I think that main question of like, do you not have a voice within your own community? And I think that question was said quite a lot to these young people, and a lot of them had said no, that they don't have that mode of like being able to get involved um, or even have their voices heard. And I really wanted to do something about it. And I think that's where the Youth Climate Commission came in. Is like, we need young people in government, and this is the way that we would do it, is to really make sure on a hyper localized level we can get young people involved, but in a huge, like, in the masses. And so that's where, I think a lot of young people are seeing is that we can get involved in government, and we can be the ones to be the one, like, we can be the ones that not only get educated around the systems and the policies of, our government systems, right? But we're also able to change them, in the
Yeah.
sense of whatever policies had been implemented in the previous past, we're able to go back to them and really analyze them and say, well, this isn't working for my community. Let's go ahead and change it, and then implement new motions and new new solutions towards these issues that are actually plaguing our communities. Like, I always say, who better to understand the issues that are going on in in our own in our own community than the community itself, right? And so I think
Yeah.
that is so important, is to make sure that there's an integration of community within these government offices. And even so, taking that mode of like creating these bodies of commissions to get young people involved, kind of transformed into saying, like, how can we spread this, and I think that's where we're at now, of spreading this and creating even more youth climate commissions across the United States, or even abroad. So many other young people are creating commissions and councils and bodies of which of not only in government but also in companies. I think a lot of companies are starting these youth councils and youth forums and different commissions of young people to really help guide the company to implement solutions around these huge issues, and not just climate change, but when we're talking about what issues a company might be interested in. I think there's quite a lot. And so many young people are not only going into the government sector, so many people are going into the private sector, in the sense of like companies and um, you know uh, just huge organizations who have quite a lot of power. And so I think I do see that shift happening, but it's not happening fast enough. So I think a lot of young people are advocating for it to happen faster and to include more young people in those in those bodies.
Yeah.
But it is happening. It is happening. I will say it's definitely something that I've seen, and something that I'm also currently participating in. And was able to do.
Yeah, of course. I think that's great. I mean, it is just about creating connection, isn't it? It's that sort of lack of voice or lack of communication between that I definitely felt growing up between oddly local governments and community. I suppose it's difficult to say as a kid what you feel growing up, but you don't feel involved in local government necessarily. It doesn't. It feels like sort of your parents' role, or your in an elderly place. And it does seem that the responsibility is falling on young people to actually open up those lines of communication and that connection, rather than it being the other way around. So I imagine that sort of feeds into why it's a slow process. But yeah, it's good to hear that it's happening. I feel like, I suppose, it's happening from my perspective, but it's good to have organizations that are actually trying to push that through, because it does seem important, really important.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I'm interested in is why, or what is the thing that you're most worried about in terms of climate change? Because you must be quite involved in it by now. You've got a lot of knowledge, a lot of holistic experience around the different issues of climate change. And I think when people hear it, it just seems like a very big issue at the moment. But I'm always interested to hear what people's priorities are when it comes to climate change when they're working in it.
Yeah, I think that's a quite difficult question, because, I worry about everything. All these issues are quite important to me. And I think one of the things that I worry about the most is that we aren't moving as fast enough to implement these, quite important solutions, whether we look at nature-based solutions or just the more holistic solutions in that sense. I think we need to be moving at a pace that is quite fast. And I think young people are the ones, this is the reason why I focus on young people so much, is that they are the ones that are really pushing for these solutions to be implemented fast. And even some of them are working towards implementing them, and a lot of them are also creating these new solutions to solve a lot of the injustices that have yet to be even solved. And so I think that's the beauty of it. But I also just, I'm really quite scared that, that sense of urgency for me is quite different. It's the urgency of implementation. And I think that's what I worry about the most. And I think also another added layer to that would be, I think a lot of the solutions that are out there, I think quite a lot of people, and when I mean that, I mean quite a lot of young people are still being educated on these solutions. So I would hate for a lot of solutions that are really problematic and actually won't help, solve the climate crisis and exacerbate it, are going to be supported. And I think that's another thing that a lot of young people are doing, is to make sure that young people are educated on the solutions and they're pushing the correct solutions, so that it's not just we're not only protecting both people and the planet, but making sure that we have a longevity of solving these injustices. And that might not make sense, but I think it's in the sense of like making sure, if we truly want to solve these injustices, we have to make sure the solutions that we're implementing are actually going to benefit not only the people who are being affected, but also make sure that it never happens again. And so I think that's where the longevity of the solution really comes in. And I think just to be really put it simply, it's like those are the things that I worry about the most, is that making sure that we educate young people on the correct solutions, that we have this sense of urgency around the solutions, and we get moving with the correct solutions. And I don't know.
Yeah. No, I think
I always stumble on this. Sorry, I always stumble on this question. I think it's like, us youth climate activists, and just us, people who are passionate about climate and who are working in climate. I think there's no one issue, and if there is, we tend to hyper focus on it. But I think, for me, at least, my journey has really not only focused on one issue; it's been focused on so many different issues, and that's what I find most important, is we can't just focus on one issue. This whole movement is intersectional, right? And it's not only intersectional, it's intergenerational. It's not just young people, it's also much older people and people in between. And so it's not just one generation, it's multitude of generations and a multitude of issues and different, things that we have to focus on. So I think that's my main concern, is that when we talk about climate change, we're not just talking about the planet, we're talking about the people. And I think that integration is just barely being made.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's also integrated. So I feel similarly, especially when people talk about this whole Malthusian versus cornucopian, which basically is, just people listening, it's like, well, technology will save us. We're constantly providing technology that will improve the climate impacts. And what you were mentioning there about whether it's the actual problem to solve, people get so fixated on a particular problem to solve that it doesn't change the philosophy behind why that problem existed in the first place. And that's what scares me, is that things will just get better without actually changing the deep-rooted philosophy in the way that we live. It'll just get better because we're finding short-term solutions to it, and then it's going to happen again. And that's a terrifying prospect to me. So I relate quite heavily to that. To that idea and that fear.
And I framed it in a way that is quite simple. It's the simplest thing of saying the longevity of a solution, because I do agree with you in the sense that in these contexts we have to really deeply be rooted in exploring and seeing how these injustices came about in the first place, right? What systems are not working, and how can we go in and really change the system to work for everyone and the planet in the long term, because these current systems and the status quo are not working for working class people. They're not working for BIPOC people, which is Black, Indigenous people of color, and just overall, it's not working for the global South. And I think those, a lot of young people see that, and a lot of young people are wanting to shift and really change that. And I think that's something that that worries me, is that we're not. I think a lot of world leaders don't have that viewpoint, and they're saying that this system works for all, but I think we're implementing all these short-term solutions toward within a system that's already been broken, and obviously cannot be fixed until we actually change all of it. And so I think I didn't want to quite say that, given that it's something that a lot of young people are still kind of learning about, and really making sure that we quite understand the complex issues that there are quite a lot of people in this world that are really, again, they are quite greedy, and I think they benefit from this system. And there are quite a lot of people in this world that don't benefit from this system and are having to, suffer essentially, and be on the front lines of these injustices that are plaguing not only their communities, but so much more than that, their health, everything, and even their families generationally are being affected. And I think that's something that we have to, and we must understand and quite learn. And I think that's what a lot of young people are not only learning, but kind of now wanting to fix. And it's something that we've been pushing on to other generations to kind of understand that kind of intersectional lens of like these systems that are currently in place are not working for everyone. They're not working for quite a lot of population. So how can we make it work for everyone, and how can we actually solve these injustices without the short-term solutions, or even continuing these conversations when we already have all the solutions that we need to implement, right? I think that's a really important topic that quite a lot of people kind of forget about. But yeah,
I agree. I mean, I'm hoping, and I think that there are steps. I hardly have any answers. When people ask me, I studied this, for years, and I'm interested in it, but it doesn't mean I have answers. But I always feel like, exactly like you said, when you can induce a conversation between people and create a connection and develop empathy, at least it's a step in the right direction. So I just imagine it's lots of little baby steps, and if that means talking about renewable energy or not using plastic bags, it's all a step in the right direction, right? And I mean, talking about solutions, again, I think this is probably something that's really difficult to answer, but what's one thing you'd like to see people do to support our planet, essentially, or to support one another? You've talked a lot about the intersectionality of the problem. Is there something you'd recommend people do first before anything else?
We have quite a lot of power. I think I always say it, our most powerful tool in our arsenal is our voices, but not only our voices, is that the way that we utilize our voices on these issues, by talking about them, by coming up with solutions and whatnot. That's one way. And a second way is to really get involved in electoral politics. We have the power of our voices in elections and electing leaders who are going to act not just in the urgency for this crisis, but meeting the crisis where it needs to be met at. And so electing leaders that will do right by not only the planet, but for the people. And I think that is what a lot of the power that we hold, and something that we can do, is by voting for the planet and voting for the people who are the most affected by these injustices. We have quite a lot of advocacy power in so many different ways, and for governments and corporations. And I think one of the things that we need to remember is that we are all consumers, and we were to, band together and really stop the destructive forces these companies hold, in the sense that we won't purchase from them anymore, given that they're harming not only the people who people on the front lines, but also the planet, we can really shift their mindsets to changing their modes of practices and their entire company structures to support the planet as well as the people and whatnot. And so I think we hold a lot of power as consumers. We hold a lot of power as voters. We hold a lot of power just by utilizing our voices. That's really, really important. And just to kind of get into it more is that we hold a lot of power in our jobs. I think a lot of the things that we kind of, when we're talking about climate change, a lot of people don't relate climate to, jobs. And I think a lot of people need to understand that jobs are going to be the really kind of the future of how we can really transform this movement, in the sense that there are climate jobs. How can we get into in any different profession that you're going into, there are bound to be climate jobs. And I think just taking up that work for the planet and for the people is something that's quite important. And I wish I can go into more specifics around what type of jobs there are, but I mean, if you look into it really, in every single industry, there's bound to be one climate job. And I think from what I've seen, I think even when you don't have experience, a lot of these jobs are willing to train you and so that you're ready to take on this position or even go into this profession and whatnot. And so I think that's the beauty of it, is that there's so much support around getting people into climate jobs. And then we have the ability to implement solutions. And I mean, the broad scope, not that I'm not already saying what I've mentioned is not solutions. They are solutions, and they are long term and even short term in that sense. But we do have solutions that we can implement, like nature-based solutions, like the solutions in regeneration. And there are quite a lot of different solutions that we can be implementing now. And so I think we have all these modes of ways to really advocate for the planet and for the people who are being affected. We just need to be doing it at a faster pace. Not that we're not doing it, but I think we need to be doing it at a faster pace. So everyone that might be hearing this podcast needs to be getting involved in one way or another, from the list of things that I've kind of listed out of how to get involved and what we can do. And we can do so much as not only young people, but we can just do so much as people to solve these issues. It's about us willing to act, and it's also our willingness to speak out against these injustices. And I think our first step needs to be to speak out against these injustices, because if you're able to speak out against these injustices, something can be done. And it really, again, I think I'll take what Naomi Klein once said to me, is that one person can be the spark, but once that spark gets started, I think all of us collectively become the wildfire. And we need to run with that. If you're able to utilize your voice in your community, in your local community, you have started that spark to really ignite a storm of people wanting to take action, or even joining you in that fight to make a difference, to make an impact, and really not only change your community, but neighboring communities. And that change, that impact is seen far and wide, and that inspires others to really take action. So I think that's what I find so beautiful and so moving about this movement, is that there's not just one mode of acting or implementing solutions or doing all of this work. There's so many ways to get involved and do good by the people and the planet. And I think people just need to take that first step. So, yeah.
Listen, Kevin, I think that's a brilliant message to end on, and it's been a real pleasure speaking to you. You've continued this theme of inspiring young people doing amazing things for our planet that I'm speaking to. And I think what you're doing, making leaders, I think it takes a leader to make a leader, and wish you all the luck with it. I think you're doing really great things. So thank you so much for being on the podcast. Really, really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. And honestly, we are all leaders in our own perspective, rights, and in our own communities, and all we have to do is continue using our voices to make that difference. So I do appreciate you having this conversation with me, and even reaching out for this podcast. So can't wait for it to come out.